In the year 2067, as the world teetered on the edge of a new millennium, an event occurred that would leave a permanent scar on the collective memory of humanity. It wasn't a natural disaster, nor a political upheaval, but something far more subtle and far more terrifying. The first major prophecy regarding the end times wasn't announced with the dramatic flair of an apocalypse movie, but in the quiet corners of the internet, where cryptic messages began to spread like wildfire. These weren't the typical doomsday predictions from obscure cults or internet conspiracy theorists. These were eerily accurate accounts of world events, predicting with chilling precision how society would begin to unravel, one small piece at a time. The prophecies, however, were not new. They had existed for centuries, passed down through history, shrouded in mystery. Some had emerged from ancient texts, others from the lips of self-proclaimed prophets who'd been dismissed as lunatics or charlatans. Yet as the years went on, these scattered fragments of ancient wisdom seemed to be slowly aligning with the reality unfolding before humanity's eyes. What made these prophecies even more disturbing was that they had been written in such a way that they were open to interpretation. For every person who saw them as a warning, there was another who viewed them as nothing more than coincidence. But the one prophecy that stood above the rest was the one spoken of by a man who would later become known as the Oracle of the End Times. His name was Dr. Elias Cade, a scientist, a historian, and a philosopher who had studied the ancient texts for most of his life. He was not a religious man, but his research led him to the discovery of patterns, cycles, and events that seemed to repeat themselves throughout history. His prediction was simple, yet haunting. The end will not come with a bang, but a whisper, and those who fail to listen will be swept away in the tide of change. For years, Dr. Cade's prediction was ridiculed. His theories seemed far-fetched, but over time, they began to resonate with a growing number of people who had begun to notice unsettling trends in the world around them. From the rise of political extremism to the unpredictable weather patterns that disrupted economies, to the rapid advance of technology that left entire industries obsolete, the signs were there. But no one knew how to interpret them. As his influence grew, Dr. Cade found himself at the center of an unprecedented wave of change. People from all walks of life turned to him for answers. They came with questions about their future, about the fate of humanity, and most importantly, how to survive in a world that seemed to be disintegrating before their eyes. And so, the Oracle of the End Times began to speak. But what was the truth behind these mysterious prophecies? Were they simply a reflection of human anxiety? Or did they hold a deeper truth? And if the world was indeed heading towards its end, what could people do to prepare for the inevitable? Dr. Elias Cade was not the type of man who sought fame or recognition. He was, in every sense of the word, an academic. His early years were spent in the dusty libraries of the world, poring over ancient manuscripts that had survived the ravages of time. Many of these texts had been forgotten by most historians, but not by Cade. His obsession with deciphering them wasn't just about curiosity, it was about understanding patterns. Patterns in human behavior, in politics, in nature, and most importantly, in the cycles of history. Dr. Cade's research took him to the most remote corners of the earth, from the deserts of Egypt to the ruins of the Mayan civilization. He searched for clues. What he found were not just stories of gods and monsters, but cryptic symbols and references to a global catastrophe that would occur once every few centuries. These events, according to the ancient texts, were part of a larger, cyclical pattern that was both inevitable and unavoidable. But Cade wasn't satisfied with merely interpreting ancient texts. He was determined to understand why these events kept repeating themselves and what humanity could do to avoid them. It was during one of his research trips, in a forgotten temple deep in the Amazon rainforest, that Cade uncovered something that would change the course of history. Hidden in the temple's archives was a manuscript unlike any he had ever seen. The text was written in an unknown language, but it was accompanied by detailed illustrations and diagrams that depicted celestial alignments, weather patterns, and even the rise and fall of civilizations. The manuscript's conclusion was chilling. The end is not a singular event, but a process. The world will not end in a single cataclysmic explosion, but in a gradual disintegration of its systems. Only those who can adapt will survive. Cade's heart raced as he translated the text. It was as if he had discovered the blueprint of humanity's future. The manuscript spoke of a coming global shift, a time when political systems would collapse, economies would crumble, and the environment would no longer sustain human life as it once had. But it wasn't the end, per se. It was a transition, a shift into a new era where only the adaptable would thrive. For years, Dr. Cade kept his discovery to himself, unwilling to share the terrifying predictions with the world. But as time went on, the signs began to surface. It was as if the world was waking up to the same reality Cade had read about. The signs were undeniable. First, there were the natural disasters. Hurricanes, earthquakes, and wildfires became more frequent and more destructive. Scientists were baffled by the increasing severity of these events, unable to attribute them solely to climate change. Dr. Cade, however, saw them as the first of many warning signs, the early stages of the global shift foretold in the ancient texts. Then came the political upheavals. Governments that had once seemed stable began to crumble under the weight of corruption and greed. People took to the streets in protest, demanding change, but no matter how hard they tried, the systems of power remained intact, resistant to any meaningful reform. Dr. Cade knew that the collapse of political institutions was an essential part of the prophecy. It was not a random occurrence, it was a symptom of the greater process at work. But it wasn't just the world's systems that were in turmoil. Humanity itself was changing. People became more disconnected from one another, absorbed in their digital worlds, isolated by technology. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for ideological warfare, where every opinion was a potential source of conflict. Trust in traditional institutions, from the media to the educational system, began to erode. People sought answers, but the answers were increasingly difficult to find. It was during this period of global instability that Dr. Cade decided to step forward. He had spent years studying the ancient texts, and now he realized that the time had come for him to share his knowledge. The world was not simply facing a series of unfortunate events. It was facing a profound transformation, a shift that would determine the future of humanity. With great reluctance, Cade began to speak publicly. He appeared on news programs, giving interviews and sharing his findings. He explained the ancient prophecies, the patterns that had emerged, and the inevitable consequences of humanity's failure to adapt. His message was clear: the world is changing, and only those who understand the cycles of history will survive the coming transformation. At first, Dr. Cade's words were met with skepticism. People dismissed him as a madman or a doomsday prophet. But as the events he had predicted began to unfold, people started to listen. The natural disasters grew more severe. The political chaos spread, and society seemed to unravel at an alarming rate. The world was changing, and Cade's predictions were no longer just theories, they were reality. The oracle of the end times, as Cade had come to be known, became a symbol of both hope and fear. People flocked to him for answers, seeking guidance on how to survive the coming transformation. Cade's message was simple yet profound: adapt or perish. The world is no longer the same, and those who refuse to change will be left behind. As Cade's influence grew, so did the movement that he had inadvertently started. People began to see the world through a different lens. They started to understand that the problems they faced, from climate change to political instability to economic inequality, were not isolated issues. They were all interconnected, part of a larger cycle that was beyond their control. The only way to survive the coming changes was to embrace them, to adapt, and to be prepared for the world that was emerging. But what did it mean to truly adapt? Cade's teachings went beyond survivalism. He encouraged people to rethink their relationship with nature, with technology, and with each other. He urged businesses to adopt sustainable practices, to focus on long-term growth rather than short-term profits. He spoke about the importance of collaboration over competition, of creating communities that could support one another in times of crisis. And he warned against the dangers of complacency, the belief that everything would return to normal once the storm passed. The oracle of the end times had spoken, but his message was not one of despair. It was a call to action, a reminder that humanity had the power to shape its own future. The question was no longer whether the world would end, but how humanity would navigate the transformation that was already underway. As Dr. Elias Cade's warnings spread across the world, humanity found itself at a crossroads. The global systems that had once seemed unshakable were now being tested like never before. Governments struggled to keep up with the rapidly changing landscape, while ordinary people grappled with a profound sense of uncertainty. It was as if the world had entered a new era, one that was both exhilarating and terrifying in its unpredictability. Cade's message was clear: adaptation was no longer optional. It was essential, but for many, the path to adaptation was unclear, and the fear of change paralyzed them. In the months following his initial public appearances, Cade continued to speak out, advocating for a new way of thinking, one that transcended the traditional concepts of progress and growth. He emphasized that humanity was entering a time of great transformation, a time when the old ways of doing things would no longer suffice. Business as usual was no longer an option, and anyone who clung to the past would be left behind. At first, the response was mixed. Some people embraced Cade's message, eager to change and evolve. They were the early adopters, the visionaries who saw the potential for a new world. They began to take action, shifting their lifestyles and businesses to align with the principles Cade had outlined. Sustainable practices, long-term planning, and cooperation over competition became the guiding philosophies for this new generation of leaders. However, there were others who resisted the call to adapt. These were the people who had invested their lives in the old systems, those whose identities were tied to the traditional ways of business and politics. They were the corporate executives who had built their empires on the backs of exploited workers, the politicians who had clung to power through division and deceit. For them, the idea of change was a threat to their wealth, their influence, and their very way of life. This resistance to change was perhaps the greatest obstacle humanity faced. The old systems were deeply entrenched, and those who had the most to lose were determined to maintain the status quo at any cost. They fought back, using their resources and influence to suppress the growing movement. They labeled Cade and his followers as radical idealists, warning the public that such drastic changes would lead to chaos and instability. They propagated fear, making the idea of adaptation seem impossible, even dangerous. But Cade had prepared for this. He knew that resistance was inevitable. In fact, it was a sign that his message was gaining traction. The stronger the opposition, the clearer it became that the world was on the brink of something monumental. Cade's teachings were not just a response to current events. They were a blueprint for the future, a future that would require both courage and wisdom to navigate. Cade's followers, who had begun to form small communities focused on sustainability and cooperation, faced their own set of challenges. They weren't immune to the forces of the old world. In fact, many of them found themselves caught in the crossfire of political and economic battles. As Cade's influence grew, so did the scrutiny. His critics launched smear campaigns, painting him as a charlatan and a doomsday prophet who had misinterpreted the ancient texts. They called for his silence, accusing him of inciting fear and panic. But Cade remained undeterred. He knew that the truth could never be silenced. No matter how loud the opposition became, he continued to speak, sharing his knowledge and inspiring others to take action. And as the world continued to change, so too did the movement he had sparked. More and more people began to realize that the old ways were no longer viable. They had witnessed firsthand the collapse of political systems, the devastation of the environment, and the erosion of trust in traditional institutions. The signs were undeniable. The world was entering a period of great transformation, and those who were unprepared would suffer the consequences. As Cade's message spread, new ideas began to take root. People began to question the very nature of progress. Was endless growth really the key to a better future? Or had humanity misunderstood the concept of prosperity? Cade urged his followers to redefine success, not in terms of material wealth, but in terms of sustainability, equality, and human flourishing. He spoke of a world where businesses no longer prioritized short-term profits, but long-term well-being. He advocated for a new economic model, one that valued social and environmental capital as much as financial gain. It wasn't long before the first signs of a global shift began to emerge. Across the world, businesses began to rethink their practices. Corporations that had once been solely driven by profit started to implement sustainable strategies. They reduced their carbon footprints, embraced renewable energy, and adopted fair labor practices. Some even went so far as to redistribute a portion of their profits to support social causes and environmental initiatives. While these changes were still in their infancy, they represented a significant departure from the profit-maximizing strategies of the past. In politics, too, change began to take shape. Political leaders who had once thrived on division and fear began to see the futility of their methods. Some even embraced Cade's message, advocating for policies that prioritized environmental protection, social justice, and economic equality. However, this shift was slow and uneven. Many politicians were still too entrenched in the old systems, and the battle between the forces of progress and those who clung to the past raged on. But it wasn't just businesses and governments that were changing. Ordinary people, too, began to rethink their lives. They started to realize that the relentless pursuit of wealth and status had led them down a path of discontent. They began to focus more on personal well-being, on community, and on building a more sustainable future for their children. People started to embrace minimalist lifestyles, reducing their consumption and learning to live with less. Others sought out new forms of work that allowed them to align their values with their daily actions, choosing careers that were more fulfilling and impactful. This cultural shift was the foundation for the global awakening that Cade had long predicted. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a gradual transformation, one that unfolded in small, seemingly insignificant moments, but added up to something far greater. People were beginning to understand that their individual actions, no matter how small, were part of a larger collective movement that could change the world. Cade continued to speak, but now his message was one of hope. The world was indeed changing, but it wasn't too late for humanity to adapt. The challenges were immense, but the potential for a new world was just as great. In his speeches, Cade spoke of the power of human resilience, of the capacity for individuals and communities to rise above adversity. He emphasized the importance of empathy, collaboration, and innovation in creating a future where all people could thrive. The world had reached a critical juncture. The tipping point that Dr. Elias Cade had long warned of was now upon humanity. And the transformation he had foreseen was no longer just an abstract idea or a set of theoretical prophecies. It was happening in real time. The global awakening that had been set into motion by Cade's message was now in full swing. And the question that remained was whether humanity, in all its complexity, could truly adapt to the changes that were unfolding before it. As the world grappled with the aftermath of political upheavals, environmental catastrophes, and the crumbling of outdated economic systems, one thing became increasingly clear. Those who had chosen to ignore the warning signs were now facing the consequences. Communities were divided, Businesses that had failed to pivot towards sustainability were faltering, and political leaders who clung to the past were losing their grip on power. The forces of stagnation and resistance were proving to be just as strong as the forces of progress and adaptation. And the battle between these opposing forces would determine the future of the planet. But for those who had embraced Cade's message, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The path forward was not without challenges, but it was a path that was grounded in resilience, innovation, and a willingness to rethink every aspect of how society functioned. The movement Cade had started had gained momentum, and it was clear that the world was entering a new era. One in which the traditional systems of power and control were being replaced by more inclusive, cooperative, and sustainable ways of living and doing business. Cade, now regarded as a visionary, continued to travel the world, speaking to anyone who would listen. His message had evolved, no longer just a warning of the coming collapse. His words were now a call to action, a rallying cry for those who were ready to embrace the changes that were necessary to build a better future. But his message had also grown more urgent. The time for small adjustments and incremental changes had passed. The world needed bold, decisive action, and it needed it now. At the heart of Cade's teachings was the belief that true transformation could only occur if people were willing to change not just their behaviors, but their fundamental way of thinking. He emphasized that the old paradigm, one that valued competition over cooperation, short-term profits over long-term sustainability, and individual gain over collective well-being, was no longer viable. In its place, Cade advocated for a new way of living, one that prioritized collaboration, empathy, and a deep connection with the planet. For businesses, this new paradigm meant embracing sustainability as the core principle of their operations. No longer would companies be able to thrive by exploiting natural resources and people for the sake of profit. Instead, businesses were being forced to adapt, to integrate environmental and social responsibility into their business models, and to find innovative ways to balance profitability with positive societal impact. Companies that had already started to shift their practices were beginning to see the benefits: increased consumer loyalty, greater employee satisfaction, and a more positive public image. But not all businesses were able to make the transition. Many of the largest corporations, entrenched in their old ways of thinking, found themselves struggling to adapt. Some fought tooth and nail against the movement, dismissing Cade's ideas as utopian fantasy. They clung to the belief that the only way to achieve success was through relentless expansion and profit maximization. But the market was changing, and consumers were increasingly looking to align their purchasing decisions with their values. The companies that refused to embrace this shift found themselves at a disadvantage, losing market share and facing mounting pressure from activists, governments, and the very consumers they had once sought to dominate. Cade's influence in the business world was undeniable. He had become a symbol of the new era, a beacon of hope for those who believed in a better future. But his impact was not limited to the corporate world. In the realm of politics, Cade's ideas were beginning to find traction as well. Leaders who had once been resistant to change were now reconsidering their positions. Some were even publicly endorsing Cade's vision, calling for policies that promoted sustainability, social justice, and economic equality. It was during one of Cade's speeches in a packed auditorium in New York City that the true magnitude of the transformation became evident. The event was being streamed live to millions of people around the world. And for the first time, the world's leaders, business magnates, and activists were all gathered under one roof, united by a common cause. As Cade took the stage, the energy in the room was palpable. His message was clear: the time for change is now. We can no longer afford to wait. The world is shifting, and it's up to each of us to decide whether we will be swept away by the tide or stand firm and adapt to the new world that is emerging. Cade's speech was followed by a series of panel discussions, workshops, and presentations, all focused on practical solutions for the challenges facing the world. Topics ranged from renewable energy and climate change mitigation to income inequality and the future of work. The discussions were not just theoretical, they were grounded in real-world examples of businesses, communities, and governments that had already started to implement the changes Cade had been advocating for. There was a palpable sense of urgency, but also a sense of possibility. The world was changing, and the path forward was becoming clearer by the day. However, not everyone in the audience was convinced. Some still clung to the belief that the old ways of doing things were the only way forward. They questioned whether the changes Cade was proposing were truly feasible on a global scale. They pointed to the complexities of the world's interconnected systems and argued that attempting to overhaul the global economy and political structure was a recipe for disaster. Cade listened patiently to these objections, then responded with characteristic calm. "Change is never easy," he said, "and the road ahead will be difficult. But the truth is that we are already living through the consequences of our inaction. The question we face is not whether change is possible, but whether we are willing to face the reality of what will happen if we do nothing." In the years that followed, the movement Cade had ignited continued to grow. Small-scale efforts to build sustainable businesses and communities spread across the globe. Governments, pressured by citizens and activists, began to adopt policies that promoted environmental stewardship, economic fairness, and social responsibility. The transition was not without setbacks and challenges. There were still those who resisted change, and the world's problems were far from solved. But the momentum was undeniable. People were waking up to the reality that the world was changing, and they had the power to shape that change. As the years passed, the transformation Cade had foreseen slowly began to take shape. The old systems of power and control were being replaced by new ways of thinking, new ways of doing business, and new ways of living together on this planet. The world was not perfect, far from it, but it was a world in which humanity was learning to adapt, to embrace the challenges of the future, and to build a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient society. Dr. Elias Cade's message had become a rallying cry for a generation. His name had become synonymous with the idea of adaptation, the idea that change was not something to fear, but something to embrace. The end of the world, as many had feared, had not come in the form of a cataclysmic event. Instead, it had come as a quiet whisper, a whisper that urged humanity to wake up, to adapt, and to rise to the challenge of building a better world. The story of the Oracle of the End Times was not a story of doom and gloom. It was a story of hope, of resilience, and of the power of human ingenuity. It was a story of how, in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had found a way to adapt, and in doing so, had created a new future. As Dr. Elias Cade's influence continued to spread, the world found itself in a state of quiet upheaval. The changes he had predicted were no longer abstract or distant, they were unfolding in real time. The global awakening he had sparked was no longer a matter of belief or theory, it was a movement that had taken root across the world. But even as society began to shift, there were still many who hesitated, unsure of what the future held or how they could be a part of this monumental change. For Dr. Cade, the road ahead was clear, but it was also fraught with uncertainty. He had dedicated his life to spreading the message that humanity's future depended on its ability to adapt to the changes that were coming. But now, in the final moments of his journey, he understood something deeper. The true power of transformation was not in the ideas he had shared, but in the actions taken by individuals across the globe who were willing to take that first step into the unknown. The world stood at the edge of a new horizon. The business landscape had changed irrevocably. The old ways of greed and exploitation were no longer sufficient, and a new generation of leaders had emerged. Leaders who understood that profit and purpose could coexist. They understood that success was no longer about how much one could accumulate, but how much one could give back. Business leaders, once focused solely on the bottom line, were now embracing models that prioritized people and the planet. They were building businesses that were sustainable, ethical, and deeply interconnected with their communities. Yet, despite these advances, the road to true change was still long. Many were still trapped in old paradigms, clinging to outdated systems of wealth and power. There were still those who believed that unchecked capitalism, unfettered by any moral compass, was the only way to secure prosperity. There were still politicians who refused to see the writing on the wall, unwilling to take the bold steps necessary to address the mounting crises facing the planet. And there were still individuals, paralyzed by fear or skepticism, who found it difficult to believe that their actions could make a difference in such a vast and complex world. But in the heart of this global transformation, a simple truth began to take hold. Change does not come from one person or one group alone. It comes from the collective will of the people, working together to create a better world for future generations. Each small action, each sustainable business decision, each conscious consumer choice, each vote for leaders who prioritize the common good, was a piece of the puzzle that, when added together, could change the course of history. And so, Dr. Cade, now an old man, stood on the final stage of his journey. He had seen the world shift in ways that once seemed impossible. And he had been humbled by the resilience and courage of those who had joined him in his mission. But he knew that the journey was not yet over. The final step was not for him to take. It was for those who had followed his path to continue forward, to carry the torch of transformation into the future. In his last speech, Dr. Cade stood before a crowd of thousands, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The world has changed, and we have the power to shape its future. He began, "We are no longer bound by the limitations of the past. We are free to create a world of abundance, where people, planet, and profit are in harmony. But this world will not come into being by chance. It will not happen simply because we wish it to. It will come into being because each of us takes responsibility for the part we play in this global transformation." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Some were young, their eyes bright with hope and anticipation. Others were older, their faces etched with the wisdom of experience. All of them had come to hear his words. But Dr. Cade knew that it was not his words that would matter in the end, it was their actions. The future, he realized, would not be built on promises or ideals alone. It would be built on action. "We are at the dawn of a new era," he continued, "but that dawn will only rise if we take the necessary steps. If we make the bold choices, even when they are difficult. If we embrace change, even when it scares us. We must each ask ourselves, what will I do to ensure that the world we leave behind is one worth inheriting?" The answers to that question will determine whether we succeed or fail. Dr. Cade's voice grew stronger as he spoke. The world is not waiting for a hero to come and save it. The world is waiting for us to step up, to take responsibility, to lead by example. We are the ones we have been waiting for. It is not enough to sit back and hope for change. We must be the change we wish to see in the world. As his speech came to an end, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But Dr. Cade knew that the applause was not for him. It was for the people who had heard his message and were ready to take action. It was for the business leaders who were already creating more sustainable models. It was for the activists who were fighting for justice and equality. It was for the individuals who, in their own small ways, were already beginning to build a new world. The world was changing, the future was in motion, and now, it was up to the people to decide how they would shape it. Dr. Cade stepped off the stage for the last time, content in the knowledge that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow. He had done what he could, but the rest was now in the hands of the new generation. And as he walked away, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had given the world the tools to transform, and he knew that transformation was already happening. The question now was, what will you do with that power?